For the most part, anybody who has less than 4 years of training is probably still developmental, and there are probably some exceptions to that, but I think that'd be a very safe timeline to do it. We start there. Okay, well, what are the things you need to accomplish in your first 4 years? Very basically, any athlete needs to have.
That's Sean Rigsby. He's the sports performance manager for USA Weightlifting and the owner of Heavy Metal Barbell Club. And in episode 82 of the Last Set Best Set podcast, we discussed the new funding program for USA Weightlifting athletes.
Now that we know exactly what it takes to qualify for the Olympics and the timeline, we're going to have to make continued changes to prioritize the most support for the athletes doing that. Right now, it's pretty balanced. You don't have to be technically actively trying to go to the Olympics to be on the national team this year. That's probably going to change next year.
How to know whether you should lean into an athlete's strengths or focus on fixing their weaknesses.
I think we can get really caught up in identifying these problems or these weaknesses and forget that somebody's strength is their superpower. And if you have someone special, if you have a great weightlifter, they probably have a solution, a movement strategy that's a real superpower and strength, and you can't lose sight of that. You can't be like, oh, well, once I fix this thing they suck at, they'll be even better. That's not true. I promise you that's not true. Never seen that.
And some of the behind-the-scenes challenges of trying to qualify for the Olympics.
Trying to prioritize events that are proximal or closer, but then sometimes you fly to the side of the world, the food options aren't great, you're not sleeping, you just have a bad day, which isn't a big deal when it's your hobby, but it is a big deal when it's, you miss that Olympic event, you can't use that total. What do you do now? Do you go to the one that's 4 weeks later? Do you think that's really going to go better? You got to hope that it does, right? But the pressure starts building.
Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Last Set Best Set podcast. I'm Coach Brian. I'm the owner of Big Ben Strength, and I've been teaching Olympic lifting for 11 years now.
I'm Coach Calvin, current captain of Lindenwood University's Olympic weightlifting program, as well as owner of Lionheart Weightlifting and a coach through Big Ben Strength.
And today we have a guest for you guys. We have Sean Rigsby. He is the sports performance manager for USA Weightlifting and the owner of Heavy Metal Barbell Club, as well as a highly qualified weightlifter and coach. Sean, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, guys. Can you believe that this is my job?
It's kind of crazy. I think about that every day. I'm like, how is this my job? I get to talk about weightlifting for a living. This is incredible. I wanted to first ask you a little bit what sports performance manager does for USA Weightlifting.
Sure. Yeah. So it's kind of a dual role. So, when people think about our elite weightlifting athletes, the best and the brightest that go and represent this country, there's a lot of logistical support that goes into that. And so I'm not the one booking flights or hotels or anything like that, but I'm sort of chief administrator, so to speak, making sure everything behind the scenes that needs to get done does happen. And that could mean from managing the high performance budget, drafting policy documents, working with other arms of USA Weightlifting, just for example, the Rogue Stage, how that invitational process goes, working on statistical projects so we can identify athletes, working with our recruiting coordinator. So it encompasses a pretty big spectrum across that, with the mission, of course, of winning medals at the Olympic Games and at the World Championships. So a lot of admin work. And then the other part of that is being, one of the national team coaches who goes into the field, works with all of our amazing athletes and personal coaches to maximize performance. So sometimes this role is called high performance manager. Also, we're just trying to make sure the best possible performance is occurring when we're competing in the field.
And speaking of the Olympics, you are pretty involved in the Olympic qualifying procedure, not necessarily developing the process at the Olympic level, but developing the team selection procedures for USA Weightlifting on how they choose the athletes that end up going to the Olympics. And the IOC has just recently released, not at the time of this recording, but has just recently released the Olympic qualifying process. Can you explain to us how does an athlete go to the Olympics for weightlifting? What does that process look like?
Yeah, great question. As far as we'll kind of ignore maybe a USA based one and just, go with any athlete in the world, right? More or less, you got to be top 8 in the world if you want to go to the Olympic Games in any one of your weight categories. There are only 6 weight classes on either side, male or female. So you got to be top 8 in one of those 6 categories. But that's just not enough. How do you become top 8? Well, you have 16 months to compete in at least 5 competitions. So that's roughly every other month, a little bit more of a cadence. And you have to stack 5 competition totals that put you in the top 8 ranking in the world, at which time you'll be invited to compete at the Olympics. So really tough to do. Those events are usually the continental championships. So in our case, Pan American championships and the world championships. There's a couple extra, what they're called Olympic qualifying events that are sprinkled throughout that time period. And you do have to complete 3 of those events in what they are calling period 1. So really just 2027, essentially. And then period 2, which is the first half of 2028, more or less. So 3 meets from one period, 2 from the other, top 5, stack them together. You get ranked with everybody else in the world. Hopefully you're top 8. And there's a few backdoor ways into the Olympics as well. But that's the gist of it.
So is that the average of those totals that you put together?
It's actually stacking them all together because you'll get an average from 5 events. You're correct, Calvin. So yeah, they won't be like ranking a score. Let's say it's 500 kilo total, which no one does. It won't be 2,500 kilos. It will be 500. So you are correct. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
And something that popped up while you were explaining this is that sounds like a lot of competition. I mean, a competition every other month is a lot, especially for a high performing athlete where, if they have one of those competitions not go super well, then that puts a lot of pressure on the other competitions. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
for anybody familiar with weightlifting, we kind of think, when you're designing programming, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, I don't think anybody designs a annual plan for an athlete or a program plan on the every 8-week compete tempo. And it's not just every 8 weeks, it's every 8 weeks compete internationally, which is a whole different animal and beast. I mean, a lot of these events, and we've had some of the locations for the Olympic qualifiers released just yesterday, kind of accidentally by the IWF, are nowhere near where we're located, as a country. We have 2 in our hemisphere, and that's great out of those 5 extra. But, flying to the other side of the world, adjusting to the time change, and then having the pressure, of course, I think what we love about weightlifting is how clutch you've got to be. You've got like 6 minutes, basically, to define, what should have been weeks and months of prep, right? And now you got to do it on the other side of the world, and you've got to do it over and over again, probably 8 weeks right after that.
That was something that we talked about with in our interview with Greg Everett. He said that, one thing that I think a lot of weightlifters need to get a better handle on is the idea between having an ability and testing it and evaluating how that program goes, right? And that is something that, for an amateur lifter, I think is an easy thing to start to work on the process of that. You can start to do a bunch of local meets, and you can recognize that, oh, this meet, I just didn't sleep well the night before. I was really nervous, right? But then in that instance, there's also not really much pressure. It's a hobby, right?
Yeah.
In this instance, you can have the best program and the best prep and the best lead up, but there are still so many things that are outside of your control. How does your body handle a 17-hour flight to Turkey or wherever it is that you've got to go and do a competition in? It really can make those competitions feel a lot more stressful. And make it hard to evaluate the success of that program. But then it also brings up a lot of interesting things that go into this, because essentially we have to figure out what is the best way to approach training in a competition setting where you've got to compete every other month, essentially, and put up world-class totals, like top 8 totals the whole time. So what does that process look like? How are you guys managing that?
That's a great question. So right now we're in like the planning and response phase, so I was actually on a meeting just before we hopped on this together, sort of mapping out, now that we know where the locations of those Olympic qualifiers are. By the way, we don't know the exact times. We get a whole month range. It could be at the beginning of the month, end of the month, but hey, we've got the locations and we've got the month. That's enough to start going to work. And, some of these Olympic qualifiers are as short as 4 weeks away from, a major continental or world championships, which kind of means, well, we can't really use that. 4 weeks, you could return from the other side of the world and need 2 weeks to recover from competing at that, and the time change and the travel and all of that. So for that essentially eliminates that sort of opportunity, right? And then we're trying to prioritize things with shorter travel durations, because the travel really can weigh on you. I I competed at World Championships in 2019, which is in Thailand, and that was 24 hours of flying. One of my flights was DC to Tokyo. I think that was, at that time, it was like 15 hours. I was cutting weight, so I'd packed up all my food, to make sure that I was eating the things that I needed to. I wasn't very good, so I was in a C session that had an 8 p.m. weigh-in and a 10 p.m. start time, which means I was taking my last clean and jerk at midnight. So I'm just illustrating that to give an example. Now, our lifters are very talented. They're going to be in A groups. They won't have to deal with that. And fortunately, we have support to make sure athletes get somewhere and have time to adjust and all that. I remember sleeping in the beds. It was almost like a cot with like a thin pad you'd get at nap time in kindergarten, like something they'd lay out. And I was like, is Lasha sleeping in this bed? Like, I'm sleeping in this bed, but is Lasha too? I find it hard to believe that like 170 kilo man is sleeping on this bed now. So long digression, just to say, we're thinking about, hey, how do we optimize this? How do we map this out? It's really, really difficult. And we're trying to give enough of a cadence where we're hoping that we at least get 8 weeks in between, which is already a really tough ask. We're trying to prioritize events that are proximal or closer. But then, like you just said, Brian, sometimes you fly to the side of the world, the food options aren't great, you're not sleeping, you just have a bad day, which isn't a big deal when it's your hobby, but it is a big deal when it's, you miss that Olympic event, you can't use that total. What do you do now? Do you go to the one that's 4 weeks later? Do you think that's really going to go better? You got to hope that it does, right? But the pressure starts building. And we've seen this play out the last 2 Olympic cycles, and it's what we're trying to avoid. Work with coaches and athletes to have a plan and have this mapped out, because the consistent athletes are the ones that are going to make it to the Olympics ultimately.
But before we get into that, it's time for the Onyx Lift of the Week. This week's winner goes out to Nathan Lifts Things on Instagram for this 140 kilo block clean. This is a 10 kilo PR from the blocks and a 4 kilo PR over his best clean ever. This is a crazy lift, especially to do it from the blocks. But more importantly, I just want to point out how easy this lift looked. Sometimes when you hit a crazy PR like this, it's going to be a grind. It looks a little bit ugly. This was not the case at all. This looked like it was effortless. This looked like RPE 6. Like, he had way more in the tank is what it looked like. And you could probably tell from his reaction, he thought so too. So shout out to Nathan for this lift. And if you want a chance to be considered for the lift of the week, all you got to do is tag us on Instagram at Big Ben Strength, at Calvin Lackey 81kg, at Last Set Pod, and at Onyx Weightlifting, and at Onyx Straps. All right, back to the episode.
So I'm curious, like, what kinds of training or programming recommendations are you making to either, personal coaches of athletes, as a national team coach, for athletes that have to do, let's say, these multiple 8-week preps, or maybe it even leads to being a 4-week prep. What does a program look like in that time, or what's your best recommendation?
Oh, man. So what's beautiful about the United States is the diversity of our philosophy, because there is no true American system yet, I'd say. If you learn how to become a weightlifting coach in another country, you generally are developed, and you would behave in a Soviet-inspired system, a Chinese-inspired system, so on and so forth. Here, we don't have that. So everybody has a little bit different approach, and far be it from us to say, hey, stop what you're doing and, do it this specific way, right? Especially if you're having success. The way that Olivia Reeves is being coached, programmed, developed, and having immense success is probably way different from, I don't know, let's just say Jordan Dela Cruz was trained and developed, and both of them are Olympians, some of our best ever, right? So it's not our role to say, hey, don't do it that way. So it makes it kind of tough, Calvin, to give recommendations. So I think it starts more with learning more about the coach, the athlete, their system, and then providing best practice recommendations. So we could go back to the Everett quote that Brian kind of brought, maybe don't express it as often in training, but the difference between expression and testing, like the knowledge that you can do a certain weight. So you've got to manage your intensity a great deal, but you can never get too far from it. So, if anybody knows like Bondarchuk or anything about that sort of programming system, I would encourage them to look into it, because it's kind of less traditional, long drawn out periodization, which we get inspired from track seasons. Track has a nice annual plan. They got one meet season a year they got to be good for. And then even how do you qualify for track? At least in our country, you go to the trials and you have your best day of your life. And that's pretty much it. We don't get that option in this process. They have to stay ready for a long period of time. So you can neither overdo it nor deviate too far. So I would say the best recommendation we can give is leaning on a sort of auto-regulated approach as much as possible, Calvin, and constantly monitor, like, hey, are they veering too far off the track where it's going to be a detriment to performance, without losing fitness, because they're going to have to be fit in a short amount of time.
One thing that brings up, I'm really interested in this. Calvin and I have talked a lot about, and he's really helped me change my approach to programming to be a lot more long term. I learned programming from Glenn Penley primarily, and that was the source, and that was a lot of very short term programming, and short term training cycles and things like that, and so switching to or learning more about this long term approach that Calvin uses at Lindenwood and with their athletes, it was a whole new world for me, which was very helpful. But then when we kind of get to this high level again, it seems like we can't really take long-term approaches to the program where we've got, maybe a period of time where it's a really high volume training block that's really high focus on GPP and things like that, and then work towards these competition prep phases where you're fully peaked and hitting the best lifts of your entire 3-year training block or 1-year training block, or whatever it is, right? With these high level athletes where they've got to stay in top shape for years, does that almost kind of throw that model out the window, or does it just require a slightly more balanced approach to that model?
No, I would lean towards it throws it out the window. And I think you have to think in quadrenniums, right? So you have to think of it as in 4-year cycles. You should have been doing your development, your capacity work already last year. This year, you still got most of this year. Like basically, I would say through China, essentially, this Worlds, you could be still taking a long, slow burn approach, addressing any outstanding weaknesses that you might have, ensuring that you have a large work capacity, so you can be ready to survive this onslaught. So I think it applies a little bit, but just differently. You don't get to kind of reboot the computer like that. You won't get the nice long slow approach. Glenn Penley was my first coach, so I'm very familiar, with that system and think it's great. I think Glenn was a master of finding ways to psychologically motivate an athlete. I think no one was better at gamifying training, I think, than Glenn.
He had a way of just making you want to put your best lifts up, just like for him. I don't know what it was about him, but he was very good at that.
Something about that. And, taking advantage of, to this day, like at least in my personal club, I'm a big believer that environment is kind of the driving factor behind the success. And you'll see that at high performance too. We'll see athletes who, you look at them, they got all the gifts and you're like, well, if you just did this program, you'd be successful. And that's not necessarily true. They need to be in an environment where they feel supported. They need to be working towards some things we would find very simple habits, but are difficult and challenging for them to be able to put into their practice as an athlete. So those factors kind of matter more, honestly. So as a performance manager, I'm looking at, what's their mood? What kind of situation and what kind of environment are they in? Are they getting the support that they need? Do they actually enjoy the training that they're doing? Because that stuff, it doesn't really matter whether I use like a Bompa periodization approach or an Uncle Ivan, Bulgarian approach. They've got to enjoy the training they're doing. But if those factors aren't occurring, like we need to find ways to get solutions for them. So yeah, to answer your short version, yeah, can't think of it long term. You got to be ready to go pretty quick.
Can you? I'm interested in what you were talking about with gamification of training. How is that? Is that something that you guys are applying with? I'm sure it's something that you're applying with the Heavy Metal Barbell Club.
Yeah.
I'm curious. How are you applying that with the high level athletes as well? Can you talk about maybe both?
Oh, sure. I mean, so we don't prescribe programming for like national team athletes. So for that reason, I can't really say that we play that big of a role. I will say the very function of training camps kind of fulfills the gamification. So we have typically 2 training camps a year for like gold, silver, and bronze athletes, and I can talk about what that means in the national team program. But it's essentially, our top 8 to 12 athletes per sex in the country. And so we'll bring them to training camp, and it'll usually be a very kind of sports science focused. Like this one, I'm doing it. We'll have already done our first camp after this comes out in Colorado Springs. We're doing some sports science testing. One of your future guests is coming, and he's going to use his Thea system to do some biomechanics collection while they go heavy. But they sort of gamify it themselves. What's been really unique and wonderful, I think, since the national team program came into play, is that there's now a Team USA culture. And so we don't have maybe a coaching development system, but we definitely have a kind of American way of what it means to be a weightlifter representing Team USA. And they've kind of self-organized this. It's been beautiful to watch. They're very team oriented. They're very supportive of each other. And they're not inherently gamifying it. It's not like, I'm going to do 1 more kilo than you or anything like that. But how hyped they get for each other and how invested they are in each other's journeys has kind of pushed performances that way, especially when we see them together at camps. And that carries over really, really well when we're, traveling the other side of the world competing. In my club, I'll take my Glenn inspiration. You guys probably know like the chutes and ladders or snakes and ladders approach, depending on where you're from. Lots of fun. I invented a game I call Game of Lifts, where I have point valuations for certain intensities. You get 5 attempts. If you have a PR lift, it's worth 7 points. But if you do a lift at like 80 to 84%, it's worth 1 point. The problem is if you miss, you lose 2 points because I don't want anybody to miss. So it teaches people to be very consistent while they're pushing for PRs. The person with the most points wins at the end of the game. People usually love doing that because they don't even really think about the weight. And I think that's kind of the trick in what Glenn identified. If we can find a way to take your mind off the weight that you're doing that you might consider to be an obstacle, sometimes people build up, oh man, I don't know if I could snatch 140, and it becomes this mythical thing. So if you put them in an environment where it's not really about that and they have an opportunity to shine, we almost always see PRs when we play that game just because they're not really thinking about what's on the bar. They're just trying to win the game.
That's so fun.
Yeah,
That sounds great. I'm gonna do that with our high school girls. They're gonna love that, I think. Man, okay. One thing that I was thinking about as we were talking about this, I'm curious to know how you view the role of developmental coaches and high performance coaches. I think years ago it seemed like there was a different approach to coaching where, coaches would work really hard to get their athlete to the point where they would then advance beyond the needs of them, right? They would go off and leave and go to the Olympic Training Center. And this was back when they had a residency program. And now it seems like the goal for a lot of coaches is to keep an athlete for as long as possible and take them all the way to that high level. And I think some of that is maybe a little ego driven, is like they're saying, I want to have this one athlete get really good because that'll make me that'll mean that I'm really good, or that'll mean that I can get my club finally off the ground and not like struggling or something along those lines. But I think sometimes that's at a disservice to the athlete. I've come to the conclusion personally for me, I feel like I am best as a developmental coach. I love working with young athletes and getting people started. But then once we get to that high performance level, I, it's just not as fun anymore, and it's just a lot more stressful. And I've worked with an athlete who we got to junior world team and did that, and that was a great experience. But at the end of the day, like, it was much more fun when I was teaching them how to snatch for the first time. So how
That's
do you view developmental coaches and high performance coaches through the lens of that?
It's really tough, man. I mean, again, our system's unconventional. There's no traditional pathway. There's no like real hierarchy or tiers. So in a country with like an organized coaching system or sports system, these roles exist and it's perfectly fine. There are developmental coaches who have no problem staying developmental coaches, and it's because their their job doesn't really change, or let's put it this way, their compensation doesn't really change, necessarily. Like, I'm sure the national team coach of, Russia, when they were in the game, made more money than a developmental coach, but their life didn't really meaningfully change based on the tier that they were on. Whereas, you know, this isn't a dig on capitalism or anything like that, but we're in a kind of market-based economy where the number of athletes you work with is going to kind of directly impact, more often than not, how much money you're going to earn, what kind of job security you're going to have a coach. It's really, really tough to make it as a weightlifting coach. You kidding me? To make a living, it's really, really hard. I'm so fortunate to kind of get to do that, essentially both in my role and then in our club, being as successful as it's been. It's great, but it was really, really hard to do. So I think coaches have looked at the model of, okay, if I just produce a great one, right, that's going to bring all the money in and it's going to change my life. And, it's going to provide security for me and my family. So I almost feel like it's this compensatory reward they're looking for, not necessarily an ego one. I would hope. I feel is my experience. So I think coaches have this, they're kind of trapped where they got to hold on to people, even if maybe that they're not the right person as the athlete progresses, because they just need to make money. And I'll tell you, our club, I looked at it yesterday, we have like 90 something USAW members. So we probably got like 100-ish people in the gym who just do weightlifting, at my gym. And we have a facility that offers some other services, but we're mostly a weightlifting gym. And so like, that's great. That's enough for us to have this facility and to employ coaches. And it took a lot to get here. Probably 40-50% of them are masters to, so if you want to make a living being a weightlifting coach, maybe be a master's weightlifting coach, you know what I mean? Or maybe be a youth developmental coach, because you're going to get numbers in. Find your niche and stick to it. Because I'm kind of with you, Brian. My job is high performance and I love it. I really enjoy this. I enjoy the challenge of finding solutions to problems that are unconventional. And so this job affords me that opportunity to do it for weightlifting, like my main hobby. But my other favorite thing to do is to teach someone how to snatch the first time. Like that's intermediate, anything in between, not really that interested. But showing new people how to do weightlifting the first time is just never gets old. It's so exciting. It's the best, and watching them take steps in here to do that and unlock confidence. So like, I guess I'm kind of like you. I still love that, even though I get to do high performance as well as my profession.
Hobby weightlifters and competitors training might seem the same, but there's one big difference. Competitors need to hit their best lifts on the competition platform. It doesn't matter what you did in training if you can't perform when it counts, and your program should reflect that. Instead of following random programming, maxing out all the time, and hoping for the best on game day, our Competition Strong Team program focuses on long-term progressions that set you up to have your best competition day yet. Each training cycle is carefully designed around the USA Weightlifting National Circuit, so you'll hit your biggest lifts at the Arnold, the American Open Series 2, and of course, the National Championships. If you're ready to take your training to the next level and get platform ready, then click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think the developmental thing, I would love to see more people go all in on being developmental coaches. I think it would serve the sport better too, in that we would get way more people into the sport, and I think it would serve the high performance level too, because with more people getting into the sport, we can better identify talent and things like that, and find those people who would maybe have never done it, but because you were there teaching beginners, you got them in to the door, and then it allowed them to kind of be the stepping stone into getting further and further along that process, and maybe getting into qualifying for their first national team, like in that in the first tier of it, and then advancing up the ranks and maybe finally getting to that highest level. But on that note, can we maybe talk about a little bit how the NTP program works?
Of course. Yeah. Where do you want me to start?
Let's go in and let's go in and talk about first, like, what are the differences between the new NTP program that was released this year versus kind of the first one that was released last year?
Okay. To be honest, not too many major updates. We still have the same framework. We have a national team. Before, there was really only, did I make an international team or event? Like, did I make a junior world team or something like that? Like, that's the only way you'd call yourself a member of the team, right? Now, okay, we have a year-round national team and different tiers and spots for that. So we have gold, silver, or bronze, which is, for the most part, going to be your exceptional senior athletes. At the bronze level, it's kind of meant to bridge the gap for people as they're aging out of juniors, and it's a big leap to be a good senior lifter. It allows them to get some support. And then we have our developmental level, which is actually the majority of athletes in the program, I guess, or it's about a 50-50 split. So, that's aimed at our youth and juniors, who we hope to, help keep pushing forward, give them the best advice and support that they can, and what resources we're able to deliver. So from the first year of its existence to now, I'd say the only major change was competition funding, to be honest with you, is, due to the feedback that we got and maybe not 100% expecting it, we decided to actually, in a way, reduce certain tiers competition funding, like securing that international sport, to guarantee that there's funding for senior worlds and senior Pan Ams, because previously that wasn't the case. If you weren't a gold level athlete, you could be on a senior world team, as has happened, and have to fund that. And none of us felt right with that. So we unfortunately had to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, essentially, in one direction. So that did mean, if you were a silver level athlete, you were no longer getting, as much funding as you were, and it was and whatnot. So I'd say there's no major differences other than that. The execution is probably better. I'll say that, because now it's not as new. The buy-in to it, we've had to implement some like silly administrative policies. Like, I had to write stuff about, fines for the first time, like I'm coaching NFL athletes or something, just because some people would opt into the program and not, fulfill their obligations. And so that was a learning experience. And, it's not that we're, as an organization, out to get anybody. I view it as, if you're in the program and you're not fulfilling your obligations, but you're taking support, so you're taking money and resources, you're in the way of somebody else who's more serious, So I'm not out to get anybody, but we need to get you out of the way so we can support people that are serious. That's all there is to it. So those are mostly the little tweaks and changes that we've had to make. And I'm sure we'll have to continue to do that. Now that we know exactly what it takes to qualify for the Olympics and the timeline, we're going to have to make continued changes to prioritize the most support for the athletes doing that. Right now, it's pretty balanced. You don't have to be technically actively trying to go to the Olympics to be on the national team this year. That's probably going to change next year, except at developmental level.
That makes sense. So can you give a brief, just high level overview of kind of the benefits and then the obligations of each of these levels of the team program?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. So I'll kind of start, I guess, with the gold level, and it kind of tapers down from there. But once you opt into the national team, you're, accepting that there's competition support and funding, so we're going to fund you to international events. This year, that's limited to any IWF World Championships and then the Senior Pan Am Championships, essentially. So we wouldn't fund, unfortunately, Junior Worlds or Youth Worlds or Junior Pan Am. I'm getting it wrong, so we'll have to cut that out. Sorry, guys. We wouldn't fund a Youth Pan Ams or a Junior Pan Ams, unfortunately. We decided to prioritize the Youth and Junior Worlds instead, because there's just only so much money, and that's the actual truth. You got to operate within your budget. And, we're incentivized by the USOPC to prioritize what they call Operation Gold. And so that means basically world level events. They don't identify Pan Am Championships as an Op Gold opportunity. And that's kind of built on this philosophy that if you're doing well at the Worlds, you're going to go to the Olympics. And so that's why we prioritize it that way. So it starts with the event funding. At the gold level, there's what we feel is a decent, monthly stipend. It's $3,500 a month that anybody could be compensated if you're in the top 6 for gold. Then there's an opportunity to get elite athlete health insurance. Healthcare in America is really expensive. We get a limited number of spots that we're able to offer those athletes through the USOPC, so that's great. They get $10,000 a year in what we call qualified performance expenses. So in addition to just the cash check going in the bank account every month, there's opportunity to pay for things like massage, your chiropractor, your PT, even some like equipment. If you're like, hey, I need a velocity tracker and it's really going to help my training. Okay, well, it's for your training and you're going to use it. We'll pay for that. Things like that. There's sport dietitian and sports psychology services. So they're able to meet with one of our 2 sports psych providers or our sport dietitian, give them meal plans, give them counseling support on how to cut, come up with, a performance routine, like a psychological routine that's going to allow them, or do clinical psychology work to make sure that their mental health is where it should be so they can perform. So all of that's packaged into it. There's an opportunity to work with Dr. Kip, who's our biomechanist. So he will take their lifts and perform analyses of it. And then we as national team coaches will essentially serve as sports scientists who consult with the athlete and the coach on, hey, this is what this means. This is, you're doing this much force at this moment. Here are some ways we might be able to improve it, blah, 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 based on, best practices or what we're seeing the world records being done. We have a good information on what a world record looks like on a force time curve. And so we try to apply that the best we can across different body types, and give recommendations on how they might intervene if something's going wrong. So those are the primary services. And with that becomes obligations, of course. When you employ somebody, everybody that's in the national team program is a contractor, so they're not an employee, but they're opting into saying, hey, I will do these services in return for this support. And it's essentially, you gotta post some videos for us to analyze as about every other week at the gold level. And we're gonna take those and Dr. Kip will, spit out a report on it. You've got to fill out a biweekly readiness questionnaire. So once every 2 weeks, they're getting an automated email from me that is just a simple 5-question, questionnaire that anybody in strength and conditioning would be familiar with. You've got to report and develop a readiness plan if you're getting ready for an event. So we added that this year for the first time. That's actually probably been our best first step in working more closely with athletes and coaches on specific programming strategies. We're developing an 8-week plan. That's the readiness period as we get ready for an event, and talking about what KPIs we want to see throughout that period. So that's been a really great discussion point. Other things, you agree to wear virus, singlets and apparel when we're at competitions because they're our title sponsor. They provide a lot of support. Like, I'm serious. Been with USA Weightlifting. This will be year 5. I've never seen a sponsor give this much in my time. And granted, maybe people have been there longer, have seen it, but in the years that I've been serving this role, their investment into our athletes is significant. I'll just leave it at that. So that's the long and short of it. Oh, and you have to, when you agree to compete at an international event, you have to agree to go do it. I know that might sound weird, but that did come up for the first time recently. So yeah,
you can't go to a meet and just weigh in and leave anymore. That was kind of the strategy in the last Olympic qualifying procedure. It was like, you got to go just do some weigh-ins every now and then, but then not actually compete, and that's tough because maybe it takes some resources from people who could actually bring home a medal or something like that.
Yeah, and that was kind of part of, that was a strategic part of it. Is, previously you could go do an appearance and then you could avoid the problem we already talked about, where you're competing every 8 weeks in our case. I understand it. That's no longer an option. People have to be prepared to compete. And there are, a number of mechanisms in place, like an injury or illness clause, that would excuse them, from these obligations. Or athlete safety is still a big priority of our strategy. We don't want anybody to get hurt or injured or to feel like they're forced into something. That's okay. We can have a discussion about, not doing that. But right now it's not going to look like you can just weigh in, and we have to make considerations. The weight class has changed also. So you got people adjusting, either gaining or losing weight. That makes planning and periodizing a lot more difficult, because you're no longer just planning around performance. You're planning around, hey, when is my weight going to be appropriate that I can go and compete in my new Olympic bodyweight class?
So something else that I've been seeing lately that seems to be sort of part of the national team program, but maybe it's separate, is some resident athlete spots maybe being opened up at the OTC. Um, and I haven't seen a lot of like, big picture like releases talking about, this program. It seems to be like something you guys are testing out. Could you talk about how maybe you guys are supporting athletes outside of just those camps at the OTC?
Of course. Yeah. So over the last, I'd say 2 years, our relationship with the Olympic Training Center has been developing and kind of blossoming, I guess. It's resulted in this. It started with something the OTC calls user days. So it's the opportunity for athletes to come and kind of do a short-term visit, um, just focus on training. Usually somebody would come in, a lot of Olympic athletes would come in, honestly, kind of just use it as like, I hate to call this, but like spa days almost. They're going to see sports medicine. They're getting services that maybe they don't have wherever they live. Working heavily with a PT, getting maybe medical support, but then even just going into the gym and working with strength conditioning coaches. And so we started using these user days on short-term visits. We use them with camps as well because of all the support that they give us. When you're there, you're getting fed high quality food. You can go and get into the hot tub or cold plunge. You can get into the sauna. They've got Normatec boots, all these nice amenities, right? And that continued to develop. And then they started offering us what they called short-term stays, which were something more like kind of a 3-month term. If somebody was getting ready for an event, that they could just stay there and not worry about anything but training for 3 months, because they don't have like rent to worry about. All their food's cooked for them, stuff like that. And so we trialed that kind of like last year as athletes were getting ready for Norway. Some people tested that out. And then they offered us, for the first time since the closing of the residency program, resident spots again. So there is no weightlifting facility at the Olympic Training Center at the moment, but there is a very beautiful gym with all the things you would need to do weightlifting. And so we opened that program for the first time. And I'm really thankful you asked about it, Calvin, because I agree. I don't think that we've put this out there as publicly as we could. And I think that's from a feeling of wanting to avoid confusion or past feelings about how things used to work with the residency program. So when I was lifting, one of my teammates was Morgan King when I was training, here with Glenn in Carolina, and Morgan got the opportunity to become a resident. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, Brian, difference between development, high performance coaches, and some coaches not wanting to lose their athletes. But in any case, she got the opportunity, go to the Olympic Training Center, be a resident, take advantage of all these resources. And I remember that there being a climate of, let's call it resentment or dissatisfaction with the OTC, just that iteration of the residency program, just saying, hey, you got a really good athlete, we're going to take them. And now we get to claim all the good stuff that they're doing. Right. And so I get that. I'm a coach too. That would make me really, really frustrated if you started work with somebody and it was going really well, and all of a sudden this bully comes and takes your athletes. And so we want to kind of avoid that and just picture it as an opportunity. So the USOC granted us limited resident spots, so we have to be very careful about how these are applied. We've limited those opportunities to people already in the national team on the gold, silver, or bronze levels. And, everybody applies, and we've got to see, it's a picture of, hey, how am I going to use this? How is it actually going to make me better? And if there's not a real justification for that, maybe it's not the right fit for them. We want to make sure that people are going there and growing. So Ryan Grimsland is our first resident, who's taken advantage of one of those spots and seems to be really enjoying all the support and services he gets. We hope that we're able to continue to grow the program a little bit over the next couple of years, and maybe to develop it in this other option. I think it's unrealistic to say a resident program is going to drive, the future of USA weightlifting or high performance. I think our unique superpower is all of the coaches, all of the athletes that we have, every corner of the world. I remember reading an article years ago about Russian system, and it's at the high performance level. It's considered unwise to basically coach more than like 3 athletes. Like you should be so busy as a high performance coach that like you can't do anymore because you're with them at practice every day. You've got to travel around the world with them. You've got to do in a Soviet system like all the math, to find your K value and all this kind of stuff and make adjustments. And like you're the guy, and doing that with more than 3 people is just unrealistic. And so we still feel that way. So we don't envision the program growing too large, but continuing to grow a little bit more, and provide coaching there at a bandwidth that's sustainable. And instead, we're going to take advantage of all the great coaches that we've got to keep developing the athletes that we've got.
That's such a great way to describe it. Yeah, I love that, and I think it's a great option, like you said, for maybe somebody just doesn't have the most ideal training situation back home, where they can't be with their coach at all times. Because, like you said, coaching an elite level athlete and giving them what they need is very difficult, especially if it's maybe only part of your full time job to do that. We talked about earlier in the episode, obviously, having to coach large amounts of, it might be youth or masters athletes and teaching people to snatch. And you need this big base sustaining your coaching business, if that's what you're doing, in order to support coaching maybe just a few high level athletes, maybe just 1 or 2 super high level athletes. So it's great that you guys can provide that support now. And I know even though it's not meant to be like the thing that people are chasing, I know it's definitely a big motivating factor. It's something that's just so cool to be at the Olympic Training Center. Like, I know many athletes are going to, go for that as much as they can.
Yeah, I've been there. I don't know how many times I've been there at this point. I got to train there on short trips during the previous residency program. And I still, every camp I go to, I get excited to step on campus. I don't know what it is about the air that you just like, yep, this place is great. It's solemn. It's special to be there. So I hopefully it's viewed that way.
Dude, the video quality looks like it's better in there.
It's good lighting,
Yeah, it's good lighting. I wanted to back up and talk about some of the data and the data and programming that you guys are collecting from all these developmental athletes. I think one of the maybe underrated benefits of having a national program, especially like a program where it's one system, is the collection of data from all the athletes. Because I think with that, you can learn a lot about the effectiveness of the training program. And then in our system, it's a little bit different, right? We've got this we've got this decentralized system. And so it makes it a lot harder to collect data on athletes if they're not all living and training in the same area. And you can't really keep an eye on like how many sets did this person miss or, before they hit that top set. So things like that, when it comes to the data that you guys are collecting on all of these athletes at each level of the NTP program, what are the common things that you guys are finding that athletes and coaches need to spend more time on?
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to take a minute.
Sure.
Sorry, Brian.
No, it's all good.
Right. Okay. The first thing, and even though we've talked about the Olympic process, how you can't really deviate from being ready, too often. So it kind of threw out like a long periodized approach. I'd say definitely at the developmental level, what we're seeing is underdevelopment in general physical qualities. And so that's both from observation, that's looking at the kind of strength ratios from the numbers that we do collect and whatnot. But it's probably a good idea, especially for the long-term health and success of the athlete, that they continue to develop general physical qualities, even though being on the national team generally requires you to do weightlifting often. So I'm not saying don't do snatch and clean jerk. I'm not saying don't do snatch and clean jerk heavy. I am saying, it wouldn't hurt you to go jump. It wouldn't hurt you to go sprint and maybe even do other sports. We have some athletes in the national team program right now who are actually track athletes. And so right now it's track season. So their ability to do weightlifting training is limited and compromised. And we're okay with that. I think as long as I see that they're making an effort to get in the weight room and trying to keep weightlifting part of their life, it's really hard to ask them to maybe throw away a potential scholarship. And I think it's detrimental to their long-term development to completely specialize, depending on the age, in weightlifting. So that'd be number one. we'll bring that population in and do camps. And one of the things when I design the programming for that camp is I try to gamify again, but get them to do things that they're maybe not used to doing. They might only be used to doing everything with a bar. And instead we'll just, I don't know, we'll do team ab exercises like racing with Russian twists. We'll play sharks and minnow, all this kind of stuff just to see, how well everybody's moving. And that's been, I don't want to, say anything too negative or badly. I don't want to make it sound like these athletes aren't incredible athletes, but I'm seeing a genuine need to continue to do work in that area. And I think that's a message that our coaches pick up on when they come to camps.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, that was something that I think it was maybe 2017. I remember texting Seb from Weightlifting House because I couldn't think of anybody else who had more just like encyclopedic knowledge of weightlifters at the time, and I asked him if there was a correlation between youth world champions and Olympic champions, and he said that oddly enough that there was not, at the time at least, there weren't that many athletes who were both a youth world champion that went on to go and be an Olympic champion. And and I think that means that essentially we have to be a little careful of not over specializing too early when it comes to weightlifting, right? That's a tricky thing, right? A lot of people will think of weightlifting as the sport that supports other sports, but you can get too good at it too early and lose out on development in a lot of these other qualities like sprinting, like jumping, like just general ability to move at like an athlete. I come back to the term that I think it was Power Athlete coined on developing athleticism, the ability to seamlessly integrate different movement patterns as effortlessly as possible, something along those lines, right? And we can see that athletes can do that in snatch and clean and jerk patterns, but not necessarily in other patterns that challenge outside of that. And so I think that's a really interesting point. Can you give maybe some general recommendations if we were to say, you've got an athlete who wants to get into that developmental program, or they're already in that developmental program? Try adding this in 1 to 2 times a week after your training, right? Can you give some general recommendations on like maybe where to start for that?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing is, just to be honest, plyometrics, and we that's something we'll educate them on during camps every time. So we'll do a mix of extensive and intensive plyometrics, and making sure that they're in a variety of planes. So we're not just moving linearly; we're also moving non-linearly. We're, doing things where there might be leg switches. Learning basic skips. Honestly, if you want to be a good athlete, go do track, and just learn how to do that and do a track warm up, and you'll probably be okay because you're going to do the majority of this stuff. There's some rotational exercises that might be missing that a thrower would do if you were a sprinter. There's some more intensive jump exercises you might not be getting. So I would start twice a week, have a day where you're jumping through a variety of patterns, and then another day where you're rotating, moving non-linearly, and maybe even doing some like ground-based activity, like basic crawling, things like that. That would be my go-to, because you can use that as a warm-up. It's gonna make you ready to go. It's non-barbell base. You're gonna be able to control your body in a variety of ways, but it's also going to do some really, really valuable weightlifting specific development of your tendons and your ability to generate force quickly. So even though it's general, it's still specifically feeding like the qualities that we're looking at. A weightlifter needs to be able to have tremendous body awareness, tremendous ability to develop force quickly, have a high RFD, and they need to have pretty bulletproof knees. Like, do you know a weightlifter who doesn't complain about their knees sometimes? Like almost everybody does. Well, my weightlifters don't. It's because they do plyometrics 2 to 3 times a week, every week for the last 2 years. I haven't heard a knee complaint in quite some time. So easy recommendation by just adding a little bit of that in at the start of your training.
part of programming that doesn't work, inconsistent technique, missing lifts, or going months without PRs is all signs that your program isn't working. If this is you, I'd like you to consider joining the OlyStrong team, my online weightlifting program available in 3, 4, and 5 days a week for weightlifters looking to dial in their technique, get strong, and most importantly, set PRs. Each week is structured to support the things all weightlifters need. Enough practice in the snatch and clean and jerk to dial in your technique, a consistent strength program to build big squats, pulls, and presses, and accessory work carefully chosen to build muscle that supports your Olympic lifts. The program uses logical progressions that focus on building momentum each week instead of just maxing out every week, or worse, only lifting light to work on your technique. If this sounds like something you need, then scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
One thing that people talk about often when it comes to weightlifting and plyometrics is that I've heard maybe plyometric deniers say that weightlifting improves your plyometric, your ability to jump, but jumping doesn't necessarily improve your Olympic lifts. Is that true? Like, what's the backing behind this? Is that where does that stand on?
I think it'd be both to a point, right? In that we have some great weightlifters that have high box jumps or high verticals that didn't necessarily jump. I think that they're gifted people who've been doing an explosive movement that's really similar. And yeah, they're unusually gifted at a jumping movement for somebody who doesn't really do jumps, right? But I could see the same thing, same argument, like, does lifting not improve jump performance? Because it definitely does. We have science to demonstrate that. So I think it's kind of training a spectrum, and you need to think about what time can you dedicate into your training that's going to get you the best return on what you're doing. So when I'm talking this developmental period, very small amount of time, probably big long-term return. If we were talking, I just competed at the World Championships, I have 8 weeks to do my best possible total. It's like, no, I'm not going to add that into your training. I'm not going to start there, sort of thing. So it's a time on return investment. Like, I think it'd be silly to say that developing essentially reactive strength, which is more or less what jumping is, isn't a beneficial quality to have, especially in the jerk. Plyos and a jerk are like basically the same thing. It's just that you've got a barbell on your throat, more or less. But you have to have the same level of reactive ability to amortize a jerk into getting it overhead. Okay, so I think those people haven't been coaching very long.
Can you break down what you would consider to be a developmental athlete? I've maybe been workshopping this idea a little bit because I've wanted to make a post about this. I see people post a lot of content online about improving your lifts, that is oftentimes more advanced than what most people are.
Sure.
I think that this, and maybe I just need to workshop this a little bit more and think about this a little bit more, but I do think that way more people are a lot closer to the beginner spectrum and need more beginner things in their training than they are towards the advanced spectrum and needing more advanced things. So can you maybe talk about, like, at what point is somebody not really a developmental athlete and is like actually starting to get pretty advanced?
Oh, that's a really good question, and maybe we can talk about it more and try to find a real definition. My other coach, Don McCauley, who is with us at Muscle Driver when we were training, used to call the majority of us elite novices. Yeah, that was the term. Elite novices. Maybe it was novice elites. Maybe but what he was getting at is that no one on the team wasn't very strong. No one on the team wasn't a senior nationals qualified athlete in a very short amount of time of training. So, like, I don't think anybody took more than 2 years to do like the senior national total of training weightlifting. Probably most of it was like a year or less. So that's pretty capable person, to qualify for senior nationals in that amount of time. And then several of them were much better than that, with pretty short amounts of training. But what he was getting at is, like, you're able to do serious weights, you're able to be competitive, you're able to be a national medalist, but you're missing all these other pieces because you didn't have technical development, like your technical stability in snatches and clean and jerks is relatively low because you're just a strong power athlete and you don't have a lot of exposure, or you didn't have good GPP development in whatever sport you were previously in. Because what do most sports do? Except for it's changing now, but how it used to be, other than football, you probably didn't really go into the weight room for the most part. There's at the professional level, sure, but most high school or middle school programs won't have a strength conditioning coach. They won't have a weight room. They won't have access to any of that for most of time, right? So you have somebody who did sport but didn't do formal weight room training, maybe even track training. And then they're all of a sudden really powerful and able to do these, elite totals, very, very nationally relevant totals. So to go back to your question, I think for the most part, anybody who has less than 4 years of training is probably still developmental. And there are probably some exceptions to that, but I think that'd be a very safe timeline to do it. And it doesn't mean, they're fast and slower learners. That's fine. But if we start there, okay, well, what are the things you need to accomplish in your first 4 years? Very basically, any athlete needs to have a decent work capacity. So that would be work capacity to do weightlifting. But the main thing we'd want to see is that your technical stability, the difference from one snatch to the next gets smaller and smaller. It's a more consistent outcome over and over again, regardless of really what intensity is on the bar, whether it's bar, I'm not saying deload, go back to PVC pipe, but
we're not Reddit weightlifting right now.
No, but 70%, 80%, 90% need to start looking basically the same. And you can do that repeatedly over and over again. You don't have big aberrations in that. And the third thing would be, relative balance from a ratio standpoint. Everybody's a little different. I'm sure we all know somebody who's a big squatter or big puller, and that's largely informed by their anthropometry, like what their limb lengths are, and that's fine. But you wouldn't want to see, somebody maybe who can squat 150% of their clean and jerk, but then can't overhead squat their snatch, something like that. That would ring some alarm bells as incomplete development. So I'd be interested to see your guys' response, because I don't have a good answer for you, other than that.
I think that's a pretty good one. I was initially curious to see to think through why the time marker 4 years, what's special about that. But then all the other stuff that you talk about, that makes a ton of sense. I really like that. One thing that you brought up there, having work capacity. Can you explain maybe how you would assess whether somebody's got enough work capacity?
You could stick with just number of lifts, and you'd want to see that progress over the timeline of their training. So if you're in a weightlifting system, your coaches should be tracking your number of lifts and know how it is. And I don't live or die by, a lot of classical Soviet models would be like, oh yeah, you never touch 90% and all your work is, 70 to 80%, blah, blah, blah. I don't live and die by that, but just the number of training you're going to do, should be increasing over time. And we have pretty decent benchmarks. If you go off old Soviet manuals, yeah, it'll tell you, crap, you're supposed to be doing 19,000 lifts a year by some certain point. And it's I don't think that matters, because we're talking drugged lifting, brother. That's a completely different thing. But just counting number of lifts and thinking about, is the athlete short or tall? Are they big or small? And, tracking, you'll have, if you're coaching enough people, you'll be able to look in your gym and you'll have enough variation in size and ability to be able to see, oh yeah, somebody like that can probably only handle this much training, and so on and so forth. Women can generally do more volume than men, things like that. So number of lifts would probably be the super easiest way of assessing that. And you should be able to walk a mile without getting out of breath, I guess.
So you mentioned that you guys have some benchmarks. Can you break down some of these benchmarks that you have as far as like what numbers you want to see from athletes? I really love the strength ratios that you were bringing up. We recently did an episode of the podcast. I'll link that up here for anybody who wants to listen to that. But maybe can we talk about the new benchmarks that you guys are trying to develop under, I guess, like almost an American system here?
Yeah. So one thing that we instituted, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it wasn't this year. It was halfway through last year. Was having NTP athletes do an onboarding questionnaire. So when they come in, so basically once every 6 months, we're asking them to report their PRs, just self-report. It's their 1RMs and exercises that we think are pretty valuable, and they're the most normal ones. Snatch, clean and jerk, back squat, front squat. I think clean deadlift is in there. How many people actually do a clean deadlift? Who knows? Snatch, deadlift, overhead squat or snatch balance. I think powers are in there, and then derivatives like hanger block. And we don't get into like, is it below the knee or above the knee? None of that. It's just, hey, do you have an answer for this? And if you do, great. And not everybody does. Especially our younger athletes may not have an answer. Like, I don't know what my block snatch is because my coach doesn't program them, and that's totally okay. But we get about 45 to 50 responses from essentially the best lifters in the country. So it's been really great to clean that data and aggregate it and come up with, what the ratio of what these lifters are doing. They're our best and brightest. So really they're the answer. And so we can compare that. It sounds like you guys in the previous episode talked about, the Soviet ratios, which are a little older. The classic ones also are based on data from the era of the press. So the push press on there is why I remember I was a good push presser, man, and I was always short on that one. Like everything else is fine, but I was like, dude, I'm not push pressing 184. Like I'm just not, like that's elite. So anyway, so I think there's a little bit of bias from drugs, from a population that trained press. So there's bias towards upper body, and most importantly, no women. There were 0 women in that data set. So it's a very male dominant one in a specific system. A Ukrainian sports scientist and weightlifting coach ended up kind of redoing that. I think Sergei Putsov has something like that in his literature. I couldn't give you the name of the study off the top of my head, but I remember they kind of redid it, reevaluated it, updated it, and it was a little bit more closer to reality. It seemed like a better thing. And then we have, for people who've taken like the USAW L2, they've been exposed to the German ratios, and like they did kind of the same thing we're doing. They took an elite German weightlifter and like took their maxes, and that's what they came out with. And that one, what's nice about it is that it was probably in a drug-free system. It's a lot closer to existing. It didn't have women, unfortunately. It came out pretty close to what our numbers were, just by coincidence, not that far off. So that tells me, okay, there's a little bit of validation, like our development is not complete, but not incomplete. And, maybe this thing that we've been using to look at as an example is useful. So I don't have all the numbers on top of my head, so I'll do my best. But, generally speaking, you want a back squat, about 130 to 140% of your clean and jerk. You'd want to do something like that. And people can fall anywhere in that spectrum. I told my lifters the other day, if you back squat below this, you've got a back squat problem. If you back squat above this, you've got a technique problem. And that's the easiest way that I could put it. And so you could go through and you could look, it's like, man, the X lifter, I was working with a national team developmental lifter last night, actually. And they're in the red on every pulling variation. Their squats are okay. Their hang block snatches are okay, relatively in line with recommendations, but their overhead abilities and their pulls are just in the basement. So, okay, that kind of informs what should we be working on, whether it's general posterior weakness, just a very general overhead instability, like there isn't a whole lot wrong with their technique. They're just missing these abilities. So it informs like, what can we work on, in the near to long term to correct that. And everybody's going to be different. It's okay. I coach lifters who are well below the front squat, metric, which is around 115% of your clean and jerk. I coach 3 national medalists, two are national champions, and then 1 national medalist. And they exist. They're clean and jerking weights that on paper shouldn't be happening, apparently. So it just kind of gives you that information. It's like, hey, where should I be investing my time? If you see a pattern appear like that, which it almost always does, you'll see somebody who's bad at squats is bad at all things squatting and so on.
Real quick, Brian, I hate to do this because I didn't check my stop time, but I actually have to like run right now.
Okay, no worries.
So if you guys want to finish up, just finish up. I hate to leave because this is like right in the middle of the, this is a project I'm working on at Lindenwood right now with one of our sports scientists. So it's like, I'm like, oh damn, I really want to talk about this, but I literally like bounce right now. So
you're all good. Can let's do the outro real quick. Calvin, where can people find you?
At Calvin Lackey, 81 kg on everything.
Sweet. All right, cool, man. You're good.
All right, see ya.
See you, Calvin.
Bye. Okay, now that the fluff is out of here. Okay, based off that, that brings up a really interesting question. I have been, and I have not found a good answer to this. How does a coach balance an athlete's weaknesses versus their strengths? I see sometimes people will say, oh, okay, well, I'm under on my squat number, so clearly I got to work on my squat. Well, does that mean that I need to prioritize squats completely? Does that mean I should start putting back squats at the beginning of the workout and do all of my, Olympic lifts after that? Does that mean that I should drastically reduce and maybe not even do that much Olympic lifting and just focus on squat? Should I go full Travis Mash and start squatting every single day? Like, how does an athlete know, and a coach, how does an athlete or a coach know how much effort needs to be directed towards their weaknesses versus maybe putting and continuing to put effort into the strengths, the things that got them to the level that they're at?
Oh, great question, man. So I think it goes, so you could do that assessment, right? And you could know, okay, this person's kind of bad at squatting or they're kind of bad at pulling, whatever it is. You do have to verify. You have to be a coach and you have to use your critical brain and validate, like, okay, is the numbers say X? Is what my eyes are watching and what the technique they're doing also validating that finding? And so I'll give you a pretty easy example. Somebody who's bad at squats, but pretty good at pulls or fine at pulls, generally shoots their butt up off the floor in the first pull, okay? Because their legs are weak and they can't push. And so they're going to fall back on kind of a hinge pattern to make it up. But what happens when your butt shoots up and your chest drops down in the first pull of a lift? Well, it leads to a number of technical problems. Usually it's really difficult to overcome. So if they're a long limb lifter, there may not be anything you can do about it. That may just be how they lift. That's okay. All right. But that would validate if I was seeing something like that along with, hey, their squats are, there's a dumpster fire. We've got to fix it. So then you'd start prioritizing like that. I don't think you need to go necessarily, it depends on the responder, but I don't think you need to go the full Travis Mash, but something like prioritizing squats at the beginning of a workout. Yeah. Super important. Because that tells me like, hey, I need to improve their ability to push. General leg strength is what's going to help their technique. It's going to help them recover, standing up the bar. It's going to help them apply force in the right direction. So that tells me this is the most important thing. So yeah, squats at the beginning of a session, considering like, are they somebody who needs a lot of volume or more frequency? Then you start thinking of that, like, all right, how many times do I got to do that is pretty important. So yeah, you've got to use your brain and say it's not just the number, but it's the things that I'm seeing on top of that to start making those changes. And the last thing I'll add on that is the thing you started it with is strengths and weaknesses. I think we can get really caught up in identifying these problems or these weaknesses and forget that somebody's strength is their superpower. And if you have someone special, if you have a great weightlifter, they probably have a solution, a movement strategy that's a real superpower and strength. And you can't lose sight of that. You can't be like, oh, well, once I fix this thing they suck at, they'll be even better. That's not true. I promise you that's not true. Never seen that with, and I've talked to a lot of elite track coaches who do different events. Same thing. We all see the same stuff. Don't lose sight of their superpower. Don't relegate it or forget it. Like you want to feed that when it's time. So further out, if you have time to develop and train, yeah, work the weakness, prioritize the squat at the beginning of the session. Maybe that athlete's superpower is just that long pull, where they're hinging and get out of position. And it is what it is. But guess what? They're snatching world records. Okay, well, do that then. That's fine. So as you get closer to the event, feed the superpower. Don't worry about the strength. I used to make this mistake. I coach an athlete who is terrible at front squats, great at back squats. If you're a weightlifting coach, you think a lot about specificity. And as you're getting closer to a meet, you typically prioritize front squats because it should improve clean and jerk performance, right? Maybe. But the problem is she was so bad at them that it just made her clean and jerks go terrible because I was hammering them so hard. So whereas she was great at back squats, and when we back squatted well, she'd snatch really well and she'd clean and jerk fine. So I was periodizing it wrong. I was just because I was sticking to conventional specificity. So as soon as I flipped that, had way, way better outcomes. She was clean and jerking better than ever, even though I'd like the front squat to go better. And then I was feeding her superpower appropriately. So that, she felt ready, more confident, and her snatch was going better than, any other time. So hopefully that's helpful.
So if we're looking at kind of that periodizing approach of maybe periodizing is not the right word for that, but
it still is. You're just periodizing is just positioning things in a way that you want for the outcome you want. That's all it is, right?
Right. So then where typical periodization, you would say we're going to do a back squat emphasis and then we're going to do a front squat emphasis right in the lead up to the peak for the competition.
Yeah.
And that should be the best approach because it's going to be more specific to the lift. But then you guys flipped that. So you did a front squat first and then we're essentially working on our weaknesses a little further out. We get closer to competition. We've worked on those weaknesses. We've shored up that a little bit. Now let's feed that superpower and do the things that make you feel super strong. And maybe it's a physical benefit that you see, but maybe it's also just a psychological benefit of the closer you get to competition, you start to feel great again. And you kind of start to feel like yourself again, rather than that thing that everybody says, which is 2 weeks out from a meet, you're I feel like I've never lifted before or something like that. You kind of avoid that mistake. Am I on the right track there?
That's essentially, I think it's more psychological than it is. I think there were legitimate physiological things that fed that ability, but yeah, I think it at least 50, if not majority % is okay. This feels like how it should for them. And we can't lose sight of that, and that's not a easy thing to find out. You can't do that on day one. Someone walking in your gym, you're teaching them how to weightlift for the first time. You probably can't even do that in year one, to be honest. You have to just go through the process a couple times until you figure it out. So the rules and the principles we have exist for a reason because they're there for the most people. But you'll find, I read a textbook that put individual differences last in the hierarchy of performance. And yeah, when you're starting to coach people, that's probably true. You can't escape principles. That being said, I think that was a huge miss. The individual elite performers, individual differences are probably second most important, after specificity. So
that's a really interesting, can you talk about that a little bit more? I think that's an interesting take. I would say most people would say, I'm thinking back to the, to the juggernaut principles of sports, principles of sports science or whatever that was. And individual differences was the last part of that. But then you're saying kind of as an athlete maybe gets more advanced, that becomes a bigger part of it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And so that was it was this Scientific Principles of Strength Training, which I think is a great book. I'm not hating on it. Don't at me for, digging into it. I think, how great I think it is. My coaches all read it when they start working for me. Everybody reads this. Okay,
it's phenomenal.
That's why I think it's so important. It's so important to know principles. So if you don't understand principles like specificity and volume and overload and all these things driving training, and that there's a recovery process, read this book, get an understanding of it. That being said, the book did say, individual differences are the least important consideration. I found that to not be true because individual differences essentially inform all the other things. So I just said specificity might be more important. It actually might even be more important than that, because you might find that an athlete actually does better with less specificity, less frequency of the lift for whatever reason. They do better with variations leading up to the meet. I think a lot of programs would have you snatch and clean and jerk 3 days a week or more leading up to a meet, and that's all you do. But maybe that doesn't work for them. But that's an individual difference you need to discover. I programmed for the Arnold's, an athlete, way more front squat volume than I ordinarily would give anybody else. And it worked great. But it took me a whole year to figure that out. And I did it on accident one other time, and I just was re-looking over the program, and then it worked great, right? I was like, I'm even telling her, like, I would never do this for anybody, but you seem to do really well with it. And yeah, that's our strategy now. I'm calling it the no peaking strategy, basically.
I remember seeing that. Okay, that's interesting.
So
That's an interesting. I'm glad you bring that up, because like I remember last year when Calvin was coaching me, we kind of I'd had this realization one time where I was hitting some of my biggest cleans on accident, like off program. Sorry, coach. During phases of training where I'm doing like multiple sets of 10 in the squat. And he was like, that's really interesting. And then it happened again, and we noticed it again. I routinely have hit almost all of my biggest Olympic lifts in really high volume strength phases for me. And so that's an example of like, maybe that's something that works, and that is the individual difference of this athlete. Another one that kind of brings up is like masters athletes. Maybe they don't need quite as much specificity, or maybe they need to have more frequent GPP phases or things like that. And that seems to be something that works better with that athlete, rather than what is maybe conventionally the best approach.
I completely agree. Yeah, so I think the individual differences inform it. The problem is it's not a good way to define your system necessarily, I guess. Like if you had to like outline your system, like this is how I program, you wouldn't be like, oh, well, it depends on how tall you are or something. I don't know.
Mhm.
But it does inform everything else. So I think it's important to do. I remember I did Russian squat routine, and I did 6x6 with 220, and it completely wrecked me. Right. But then 2 days later, I jerked 215. And then like later that week, I was hitting massive, snatches and cleans, and it was just, okay, whatever. I guess it works. I frequently remember times doing like 8 or 10 RMs also, Brian, where I was feeling so strong that the lifts I was pursuing were just too easy. For whatever reason, that worked. I don't know why. So pay
It's
attention
just,
to it.
yeah.
Try to it's one thing to have one data point to be like, oh, okay, this works. So don't go in with one data point. I'd tell any coach that. But I have like 2 specific meets, very strong indicators that this is the thing for that person, and just observe throughout training. Like every week, you should be testing your training. Like you're in your laboratory, they're doing it, like validate it. Like it's usually pretty obvious over the course of your program whether that stimulus was working or not. And that's where I say it's so important to keep stuff simple so you can know what the variables are when you're writing your programming. And it's like, okay, it's very clear this is working or not working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. I wanted to let bring it back around a little bit to the USA weightlifting and the things that we've got going on. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about the athlete transition program. I saw you guys post about this. I feel like it kind of went a little bit under the radar and wasn't getting like. I don't think people are talking about this enough. You guys have put together something really interesting with this athlete transition program. Can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, man, I'm fired up about it. It's really cool. I've been watching other sports. One's really notable is bobsled, USA bobsled. And because Winter Olympics are big right now, everyone will see they have this great campaign going. Look at me doing ads for them instead of us. But they basically have a combine of certain tests, and for many years you could just go on their website and you could find these benchmarks, these standards of what they're looking for in the next Olympic bobsledder. I was like, dude, we need that. Absolutely need to happen. And the problem is not a lot of people snatch or clean and jerk, right? So how do we reverse engineer that? So the department and then our recruiting coordinator, we're trying to figure out how we do it. And we kind of use this ratio data-driven approach. So once we had these numbers, we were able to extrapolate things like a power clean or a back squat that people were using and put that in line with our like very rigorous, statistically designed A standards across different age categories, and go, oh, okay, like if we're trying to find the next great person that's going to meet these high standards, in this case, like our junior, I think we're using our junior A standards, our youth A standards, and extrapolating these numbers. This is the power clean you need to do. This is the back squat you need to do. And it's okay if you don't do this snatch or something like that. Spoke to an athlete yesterday who doesn't snatch, what's posted, but they do the other things, and they have some other strong indicators. So these standards are available on our website. I believe it's under the national team tab. There's something on recruiting. So we've got them across the different weight categories and age groups. So if you're let's say 200-pound male, you can go on there and you could find out, what do I need to power clean? And I think there's a lot of guys out there doing it. I think there's plenty of athletes who are doing collegiate athletics who want to continue being involved in athletics, but professional sport may not be an option for them in whatever that is, both male and female. And we want to hear from you. I want to meet you. I want you to read these standards. I want you to show me doing your back squat or your power clean. Do you know the quarterback Jordan Love? He plays for the Green Bay Packers. He's a quarterback. He went to a school called Utah State, and he front squatted, perfect posture, ass to grass. I think it was like 160 kilos. Okay. That's a quarterback. I doubt he weighs 200 pounds, wet, something like that. That's great. So there are these people in these systems, they're strength coaches. You're out there teaching them. If you know somebody, if you got a kid who loves the weight room, but they're not going to go, further beyond collegiate sport, let us know. USA Weightlifting's recruiting department wants to find them.
And that's a really good example of that is throws. Throws is something I've kind of noticed recently where athletes will not really often pursue the professional aspect of it after the collegiate program is done. And I think that a big part of that is just like, where do you go to train that? It's just logistically a lot harder to find a place where you can throw a discus versus where you can find a barbell.
Really
And so this is a really interesting approach, because we can go and pull athletes who have had years of experience. I mean, a Mary Tyson Lappin is a great example of this. Comes out of collegiate weightlifting, of collegiate throws, takes a couple years off and gets back into the weightlifting side of things and gets recruited hard by you guys. And she goes on to become like one of the best weightlifters that we've had, right? And then so I think that is a really good idea. I love the idea of it. Are we gonna see combines popping back up? I'm interested in this because, and I have a special association of this, because I remember when you guys did high school weightlifting combines. This was 2016 or 17. You guys, I signed up to host one. It was really interesting. You guys sent me a jump mat to do testing on with our athletes, and we did a couple other tests. We did vertical jump. We did, I think, broad jump or sprint time. I can't quite remember. Then it was like back squat, power clean, and maybe an overhead squat. There was a couple of assessments here, and it was cool. I had like 4 athletes show up, because who knew about it, right? Are you guys going to be bringing back a combine of some kind?
Working on it. There's one event at a major college that we're speaking with right now, and it'll be a multi-sport combine event. So it won't just be USA Weightlifting. It'll be for number of NGBs. So we're already working with them on that. But then there's another, I don't want to speak out of turn for the events arm of USA Weightlifting, because, I'm not my department, but there's some collaboration we're trying to work on. We're trying to work on an event that's scalable, just like you're talking about, that could be hosted anywhere, that would also be an opportunity for recruiting. So maybe not necessarily like us doing that exact combine format, but a similar scalable type event where it's getting exposed to a lot of people, and that, I get to kind of browse through. It's like, yep, you, and show up. So absolutely.
I think that's really interesting. Like, you go ahead and pair up with a couple other NGBs, because I'm sure, bobsled's going to want to do the same thing. And especially Olympic sports might be one of those that can really capitalize on talent identification from other sports, and finding athletes that can transition from other sports. Um, do you guys envision ever having to fight other NGBs over who can recruit this athlete the best? Because somebody who's good at bobsled more than likely is going to be a great weightlifter too. We
Yeah.
see athletes like Blaine McConnell is a really good example of that. Like, this dude is power cleaning or cleaning, 200 kilos, and bobsled is going to love that, right? But so would USA weightlifting.
Yeah.
How do you guys deal with that?
It's the value proposition of the opportunity, so I think now with the national team program, we're kind of like airing it out there, like, hey, here's what we can provide, very realistically. Like, we're used to competing with professional sports, right? Like, I'm still trying to find football players, right? But it's, we were communicating with one, and it's just like, how do I compete with what we can offer you when you can just go play like Canadian football and actually still make like a decent living? You know what I mean? Like, for the next couple of years, it can be potentially life changing for that kind of athlete. So we're kind of used to competing with those sports. I think we're doing a good job positioning what we can offer now, through those services, through the financial support, and trying to upscale. Honestly, the visibility that an athlete could get by doing our sport. I think our media arm's been more active than it's ever been. So trying to do that, and to be honest, almost everybody, almost every collegiate athlete's probably picked up a bar. How many know what it's like to like pilot a bobsled? Like, almost none. So we're hoping like it's just easier to connect with. As exciting as bobsled is to watch, I'm sure it's great to slide down the ice. Like, it's like, yeah, like, what this is. You can do that. You're already doing this if we're talking to you, and you're doing it really, really well. So we're hoping the connection point is just a lot easier to make.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense, right? At least the offer is that you wouldn't have to, an athlete wouldn't have to move somewhere that has a bobsled, a place where you can train bobsled, right? Like, just we don't got one in Tallahassee. I know that much. So that's one. But we have plenty of gyms that have barbells, and plenty of places where you can pick up this new sport, and it's less inconvenient to this athlete to be able to do that. Sometimes that's an interesting value prop, right? It's not so much like, am I going to pay you X amount of money, because we can't really compete with the NFL on what they could pay, but we can maybe compete on the level of inconvenience or convenience that it can be for an athlete to compete in the sport, and that's an interesting add to the value prop. I think that's cool. I know
The
we're
Olympics are in LA, baby. So just saying, no,
That's right. Yeah, and the Olympics are in LA. You wouldn't even have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Nice sunny weather and everything. I want to go ahead and get into our final question here. We've been doing a segment called "Take a Question, Leave a Question," and so we'll ask you to take this question from our previous guest, who is a friend of yours, Tom Soroka. So his question for you was, how did you navigate the transition from being an athlete to a coach athlete to a coach, and how do you view the challenges that come with each of those phases?
Oh man, way to go, Tom. Good question. Uh, Not well. Yeah, so I think it's a good. I I think it's a good. So it's a good question to talk about, to like be like a cautionary tale, I guess, or something like that. And not that I regret nothing about my journey or life. Like, I tell people all the time, I've had the absolute best life, and it's just, there's still so much more to go, and it's because of sport, and this sport specifically. But I think I think there's a pressure, or maybe it's a monetary driver to become a coach too soon. When people are still being athletes. It definitely was for me. It was like, in the wave and the boom of CrossFit, it was like, okay, well, you can be a weightlifter, but this is how you make a living. You go coach CrossFitters, and that evolved into remote coaching. And now there were weightlifting gyms then, sort of, but now you could run a club and it could be your business, sort of thing. So that happened in a relatively short amount of time. And I don't think anybody really foresaw it. So you just jumped in, you're trying to make a living. But looking back, I would advise people to take your time and not rush to become a coach. You got to make your mistakes somewhere. Don't get me wrong. So like, when you start coaching, you're not going to be a very good coach. You know, after a couple of years, you're still not going to be very good, but you'll be better than you were, and so on and so forth. So don't be in a rush to do that. Enjoy your athlete experience as long as possible, because it'll start competing. I think a lot of people ran into the trap, especially you saw it in CrossFit, like, oh, well, I'm an elite CrossFit athlete and I can open my box and run it and I'll just train for the games and blah, blah, blah. And, most of those gyms are closed because they weren't really thinking about how to be a good coach, or I guess in that case, how to be a good business person, and run the business. So take your time. I probably could have taken more time doing that. I definitely made compromises also on the athletes that I would work with because I needed to, because I was stuck in a situation to have to do that. And it almost certainly, not that my athletic career was, the best ever. It definitely got cut short more by injury than by like the need to coach. But I'd say definitely if I had put more into that and worried less about growth and coaching and all that, I probably would have lifted longer, and I probably maybe could have lifted a little bit heavier. So like, this is going to sound like a bummer. One day you're going to lift your last PR. There's nothing you can do about it. It's going to happen. So push that day back as long as possible. Give yourself everything you can, if you care about it, if you really value it. So like, put as much as you can into it, because one day it'll end and there'll be no going back. You'll just be surprised that it's gone, and so enjoy it. Enjoy it as much as possible. Stay here as long as you can.
I think that's absolutely great advice. I mean, I agree. I think I started coaching way too soon. Like I started coaching to help the gym out and not for anything any other reason. And I think that definitely stunted my athletic career and being a better weightlifter. And I think it's one of my only or biggest regrets was starting coaching too soon. And it's worked out. I'm glad that I've done it. It's been 12 years now since then. And so, not going back. I'm not going to go start my athletic career now and try and get it going, or stop coaching to make that happen. But I do think that I started coaching too soon, and I think it was a disservice to me as an athlete. I think it stunted my ability to be a better coach because I didn't have a lot of the athletic experience that, especially once I started coaching more advanced athletes, that I kind of needed to have at that level. And so, I agree. I think it's a fantastic piece of advice, and I think that trying to be a coach athlete is really tough. Like it can be done. It can be done, but if you're eventually gonna get to a point where you have to make a decision on either end of them, and that's going to be a really hard decision to make. It's going to be a really hard decision either way, and you definitely don't want that decision to have to be motivated by, especially not by financial decision, right? Like that is the worst, because then it it doesn't help your athletes any for that to be the case, And so
Yeah, I
I think
think
that that's a good.
yeah, if you're a great coach, you're inherently going to have to be unselfish, and you're going to have to put the athletes first, and that just means you're not putting yourself first. So you're robbing one or the other, right? Essentially, I think that's what you're getting at. I know we're supposed to wrap. I want to ask you one question. Do you
Sure.
think, because of what you said, do you think that a great coach needs to have been a pretty good or great athlete to be successful?
No, I don't. But it depends on a few things. It depends on what pretty good means, obviously, but I think it depends on what successful means too. I think that you don't have to be a great athlete to be a great coach, but I think that it certainly helps in the areas that require knowing what it feels like, what an athlete's going. Now you can shore that up, you can shore that weakness up that in your coaching area by getting as educated as possible, getting as experienced as possible, by searching out other coaches and learning from them as much as you possibly can, by listening to your athletes and really doing a great job of paying attention to what they're experiencing, and making up for what you haven't experienced in getting as much experience from other people as you possibly can. And then the other part is recognizing when you're not the right fit for an athlete anymore.
Mm.
So if you get to the point where the thing that is you as a coach not having the physical lived experience, being the sole limiter for your ability to develop that athlete any further, then you have to recognize that and say that it's time to pass that off to another coach. And so I think that's my kind of take on that.
Yeah, 100% agree. I don't think you have to be I think it's a trap people fall into is that, I want to learn from X person because they were an Olympic champion or something like that. And that doesn't mean that those people can't be great coaches, but they are not at all the same thing. They are completely different skill sets. And so it's incredibly helpful and useful to have been an athlete in the sport that you hope to coach, so that you have learned the craft because you can better relate. If you weren't, that's okay. Just have spent the time. There's like a minimum amount of time in craft development you need to have had, right? I think, but that doesn't mean that you were, a Team USA athlete or anything like that. So, yeah, thank you, brother.
100%. Yeah, and I think that at the end of the day, like, you can't really go back. So all you can do is focus on what you can do to move forward and just getting as good as possible. And so honing the craft. And I think that there is a level of, like, you should still be training in some form or fashion. And maybe it doesn't mean that you're competing, or maybe it means that you're, training and signing up for a local competition. You're pushing yourself and you're still learning. You're getting that physical, that physical learning that you just still need to have and know what it feels like to push, because you have to know what you're asking from your athletes. I think, like, if you're not competing and you're just, it's way easier to tell somebody what to do, if you're not also the one that has to do it. And sometimes that's like, this volume cycle is going to be crazy, but you tested it out yourself. You at least have some experience there. I think that's important.
Yeah, it's good leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, your question is going to be left for Dr. Christoph Kipp. He is a sports scientist. You know him very well, actually. But I think a lot of people may not know exactly what he does. He helps a lot with Team USA weightlifting and as well as throws, I believe, in helping analyze the biomechanics of their technique and their abilities. So what is your question for Dr. Kipp?
I think because of something we mentioned earlier, I'd like to hear him answer this. And I think I know what he'll say, but Dr. Kipp, which he hates me calling him, but Dr. Kipp, is it more important to allow an athlete to lift using the strategy that they've had success with, or to move them towards a more perfect theoretical model of technique biomechanically? And so I think he'll be able to unpackage that pretty well.
That's a good one. That's a great one. Awesome. All right, we'll go ahead and leave it there. I really appreciate you doing this. Where can people find out more about you, Heavy Metal Barbell Club, and what you're doing with USA Weightlifting?
Oh, sure. Thanks, man. I'm on Instagram. That's basically the only media that I do. I'm at Sean M. Rigsby. And then you can find Heavy Metal Barbell Club, same thing, at Heavy Metal Barbell Club. But anything USA Weightlifting, especially in the stuff that I get to do, is generally published on the Instagram or on the website, the national team home. So if you have any questions about policy, recruiting, whatever it is, I'm happy to answer them. You can DM me or send an email to sean.rigsby@usaweightlifting.org.
And you guys can find me at Big Ben Strength on everywhere. We'll catch you guys next week. Bye.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to check out this video here, or this episode of the Last Set, Best Set podcast.